I went to the first Durban conference in order to confront racism, in order to help end the scourge of anti-Semitism. Representing the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, I found myself in the middle of a storm created by a lethal combination of political actors opposed to rights, like Yasser Arafat and Fidel Castro, human rights activists who had come to plead their own cases, and diplomats for whom support of any United Nations gathering was an end in itself. In the NGO Forum of Durban 1, Jewish NGOs holding an open forum on anti-Semitism were silenced by a screaming mob. The Jewish Community Center, where we met each day, was shut down because of threats of violent protesters. The world's NGOs adopted a declaration saying that Zionism, the self-determination of the Jewish people, was racism. A statement by Jewish groups that anti-Zionism was a form of anti-Semitism was deleted by majority vote. And perhaps most distressing of all, the world's leading human rights NGOs, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, now called Human Rights First, decided to abstain exactly when it mattered most to stand up and be counted. As we Jews walked out alone, South African police insisted we hurry and provided an escort off the premises of this anti-racism meeting because our safety could no longer be guaranteed. UN officials, like UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Nave Pillay, to this day claim that the anti-Semitism at Durban 1 was on the fringes and the sole fault of NGOs, not state. That's false. And by the way, she's just repeated the Durban Declaration is a worthy document 5 minutes ago across from where we stand. I attended the negotiating sessions of the governmental committees and watched states delete every proposed provision containing concrete means to tackle anti-Semitism. And in the end, only one of 192 UN member nations was charged with racism in the Durban Declaration: Israel. The lie introduced in the General Assembly in 1975 had been reincarnated. I remember standing proudly beside the wife of Congressman Tom Lantos as he told reporters why the United States was leaving. A Holocaust survivor who recognized evil when he saw it and knew the dangers of silence. The tragedies of Durban were manifold. The anti-racism movement turned out to be a vehicle for encouraging more racism. Human rights activists decided equality rights for the majority could be built on the inequality of the few. And the United Nations, founded on the ashes of the Jewish people, became a weapon pointed at the survivors and their descendants, struggling to ensure never again. I left Durban and moved directly to New York City on September the 9th, 2001. On 9/11, I stood helplessly like so many others, myself at Columbia University, watching the smoke rise. I could not but think of the hate-mongering and intolerance that had been legitimized under UN auspices, the feigned grievances against America and freedom that had coursed through the streets of Durban and had been promoted onto the global stage. It wasn't hard to connect the dots between hate and violence, but it is a responsibility that the United Nations has never been forced to acknowledge or confront. On the contrary, over the intervening 10 years, the moral degradation of this once noble enterprise has proceeded apace. 10 years after 9/11, the United Nations still cannot define terrorism because Arab and Muslim states insist that violence against selected civilians doesn't count. For the same reason, the UN's top counterterrorism committee has never named a single terrorist organization or state sponsor of terrorism, and there is no comprehensive convention against terrorism after years of negotiation. The UN's top human rights body, the Human Rights Council, has adopted almost as many condemnations of Israel as it has for all other 192 UN member states combined. Adding up all the human rights criticisms from UN bodies directed at specific states in 2010, the most criticized country on earth was Israel. The United States was 5th, Iran was 11th. And as for the Durban Declaration, it is now the centerpiece of the UN's anti-racism agenda. So here we are, 10 years after 9/11, 10 years after the first Durban conference, Americans still grieving the violence that hate has wrought, while the United Nations is celebrating the hate itself. And as we speak on this side of the street, the United Nations is hosting Durban 3 on the other side of the street. Speaking this morning at the opening session of this anti-racism abomination, hand-picked to be the representative of the African group of countries, will be the representative of Sudan, a government whose racial and ethnic intolerance has resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands and the creation of millions of refugees. Speaking later in the morning at the Durban 3 will be the Foreign Minister of Iran, who will wallow in the opportunity that the UN has provided for his government to cast itself as something other than the leading state sponsor of terrorism around the world. And at 6 p.m. this evening, all those states which remain on the inside of this affront to human intelligence and assault on human dignity will adopt a new resolution and reaffirm the full and effective implementation of the Durban Declaration. But this time Israel and America are not alone. The Government of Canada, led by Prime Minister Stephen Harper and Cabinet Minister Jason Kenney, led the pullout from both the second and the third Durban conferences. Joining them are the United Kingdom and France, meaning all three democratic members of the permanent five powers of the UN security, the United States, United Kingdom, and France, are boycotting Durban 3, an historic rejection of the moral leadership of today's United Nations. By their sides are Italy, Australia, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Poland, New Zealand, Austria, Germany, and also Israel. Iranian Prime Minister, President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was the only world leader to attend the second Durban conference in Geneva. When he questioned the veracity of the Holocaust from the UN stage, High Commissioner Pillay remained glued to her seat as Western governments walked out en masse, even though she had the speech in advance. And as I speak, the UN's top human rights official is helping to open Durban 3. And a few short hours later, Ahmadinejad himself will walk back on to the UN podium. His words will be translated into 6 languages, webcast for free around the world, and archived for young people to study. So why are we here? We are here to shine the light of day upon the perversion of human rights and freedoms by those we charged to define and promote them. We are here to ensure that those dots between hate-mongering and brutality are seared in our collective minds. And we are here because we refuse to stand by while the defenders of the Jewish people are demonized, because make no mistake about the purposes of such a slander, it is the rejection of a Jewish state, the antithesis of the protection of human rights. So we are here because Israel needs us, and America and freedom need Israel.